Hey everyone, today I want to talk a little bit about exposure. Not that kind of exposure. Not that kind of exposure. The exposure triangle. The exposure triangle refers to the three main elements that determine a camera's exposure. You can't change one without having to change another to balance it out. First off, let's talk about aperture. A camera lens operates like a human eye, and the aperture is a measure of how wide the camera's iris is. The wider the aperture, the more light you allow and the brighter your image will be. The narrower your aperture, the less light you let in. Aperture is often adjusted on the camera or lens by modifying the camera's f-value or f-stop. But your aperture doesn't just affect your exposure. It also affects your depth of field. If you want a more shallow image where the background falls out of focus, you're going to want to use a wider aperture with a lower f-value. If you're shooting landscapes and need the majority of the shot to be in focus, then you'll want to shoot on a narrower aperture setting. This is an image at f3.5. This one is at f22. You can clearly see the difference in the background. It's also worth noting that the image at f22 is less sharp than the image at f3.5. This is due to the fact that the lens can't give you its sharpest image at a super narrow aperture such as f22. And that should pretty much cover all you need to know about aperture. Now let's get back to our good buddy, the exposure triangle, and talk about ISO. ISO is basically the camera's sensitivity to light. The higher your ISO, the brighter your image or footage will be. The lower your ISO, the darker it'll be. But the higher you set your ISO, the more noise you're going to introduce to your picture. And the lower you take it, the clearer it's going to get. It's worth noting that different ISOs perform differently for different cameras. Here's how cranking up the ISO affects pictures on my G85. The camera is performing well at 400 and maintains that performance at 800. At 1600, I can start to see some noise. Past 3200, I would no longer consider the picture usable. At 12,800, the picture is a total mess. And it doesn't get any better at 25,600. Here's the same pictures at 2 times magnification. At this magnification, you can see noise forming even at 800. But things still start to get really muddy around 1600. And that's pretty much all you need to know about ISO. Now there's only one side of the exposure triangle that we've yet to cover, and that's shutter speed. Shutter speed is how long the camera shutter is open before closing when taking pictures or videos. The longer your shutter is open, the lower your shutter speed. This allows in more light, but you're more likely to see motion blur. If you go low enough, you'll have to pop your camera on a tripod. The higher your shutter speed, the less motion blur you see, but the more light you're going to need, so you may have to compensate in other areas. In order to show how shutter speed affects images, I wanted to get some pictures of someone throwing a ball up and down at a variety of shutter speeds. To do this, I conscripted the help of the only person I trust with such an enormous and important task, my little brother.
Good? Want me to go?
At 1/5 of a second, there's significant blurring. You can see as we raise the shutter speed that the blurring is decreasing. At 1/500th of a second, there's very little blurring. At 1/2000th of a second, there's no longer any motion blur at all. But what about shutter speed for video? It basically all comes down to this. You want your shutter speed to be 1 divided by your FPS times 2. Pretty much all the time. This is how you get the most natural motion in your videos. Here's some examples of my brother waving at a variety of shutter speeds. 1/25th has too much motion blur. 1/50th is ideal. 1/125th has a strange, jerky quality to the movement. 1/500th has the same problem to an even larger degree. Alright folks, that should be everything you need to know about the exposure triangle to get started creating great photo and video content. I hope this video has been informative. Thank you so much for watching, and if you're up to it, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment.